see so many friends on the call, and I'm joined by my two colleagues and friends who are also part of the Pennsylvania Youth Justice Alliance, who I will let quickly introduce themselves, and then I'll give kind of a roadmap for what we're going to share this afternoon. So Nadia, you want to go ahead?
Hi, everyone. I'm Nadia Mozafar, she, her pronouns. I am a senior attorney at Juvenile Law Center, and I'm one of the heads of the National Debt-Free Justice Campaign, which works to end fees and fines in the justice system. So really happy to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
And hi, I'm Stephanie Arbitina, and I am the Vulnerable Youth Policy Director at Children First. We are a policy organization. We are based in Philadelphia, and we work throughout the Southeast and spend lots of time in Harrisburg working on a broad range of policy topics that affect young people from early childhood to K-12 education to health to child welfare and juvenile justice systems involvement. I'm really happy to be here with my colleagues today.
Thanks, y'all.
And all of you.
So we are really happy to be here. We have kind of a couple of purposes for this webinar today. The first is that we wanted to gather our community and folks who are interested in youth justice reform work to share a little bit about what's been happening in Pennsylvania, even in the context of some of these big federal and statewide shifts and slowdowns that we're seeing. But also to introduce this organization that we are collectively coming together to start to advocate for effective youth justice alternatives in Pennsylvania, called the Pennsylvania Youth Justice Alliance. And so we're going to try to do all of that and have some community conversation in an hour. Just a couple quick housekeeping things. I do want to encourage folks to use the Q&A function on Zoom if you have questions for us. We're going to cover a lot of information, that's going to include like acronyms and bill numbers and boring stuff like that. So if we say anything too quickly, you don't catch what we said, or you have any questions about logistical or detailed questions or strategy questions, please use that Q&A function and we'll respond to those as we go. We do also have somebody keeping an eye on the chat, but it's a little bit easier for us to respond if we see those questions in the Q&A. And we do have a few minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So be thinking about what you would like us to address beyond the presentation. So kind of the order of operations for today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the youth justice policy landscape at the federal level. Obviously, things are different now than they were a year ago, and there are some interesting knock-on effects of that. We are also going to talk about it at the state level. I think many folks probably saw in the news that we had a budget impasse until yesterday. So things are moving and shifting as we speak. Those of you who've been following the work of youth justice reform in Pennsylvania for a while will recall that there have been a series of bills over several sessions that have been moving to try to address the recommendations that really are long overdue in reforming this system. So we're going to talk about what's happening with those now and what we expect to see coming in the future. And then finally, we're going to share some kind of under the hood work that we've been doing over the past year, looking at some polling results on what works in effective messaging around youth justice. And I'll share a little bit more about the details of this, but we worked with a partner to do some actual polling of Pennsylvania voters and to understand what types of messages move people to action in this space. So that's kind of the outline of the day. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Stephanie, who's going to talk a little bit about the youth justice policy landscape.
Hi, thanks so much, Margot. So you see before you a timeline, and this is definitely not meant to be the end-all be-all of youth justice policy in Pennsylvania, but this will give you a little bit of helpful context, I think, for how far this work has come and how we landed where we are today. So we're only going to take it back the past 30 years. although it feels weird to say only at this point. So we're looking at 1995 as kind of the starting point of this timeline. And I think most folks know that the 90s was a definitely crime and response to crime was a hot topic, both nationally and locally. And here in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania legislature, the General Assembly, held a special session that year that was focused on crime. And one of the things that came out of that session was Pennsylvania Act 33. And one of the things Act 33 did was establish this goal of balanced and restorative justice, otherwise known as BARJ, as the mission of Pennsylvania's juvenile justice system. So this is like a notable milestone in the system in Pennsylvania. And basically at its core was this idea that victims, the community, and youth who have committed offenses should receive balanced attention and all gain benefits from their interactions with the system. And so they identified these principles of community protection, accountability, and competency development for the young people as some core principles of the system at that time. That philosophy still exists in the system as its mission, as its stated mission today. Fast forward 10 years from there, Pennsylvania was the first state selected by the MacArthur Foundation to implement its models for change reform strategy. And basically, and our colleagues at Juvenile Law Center were a major part of that. So shout out to them as well as the system partners that participated in this. And basically, the MacArthur Foundation supported selected reforms. And some of the high level overview of that is that they focused on reducing the detention of youth that were minorities, improving youth mental health screenings for those young people that entered into the system, establishing what's called PACT, or the PA Academic and Career Technical Training Alliance, to improve that career readiness for young people coming out of the system, and basically sustaining any reforms and through what is still known as the Juvenile Justice System Enhancement Strategy. And what that focused on and still focuses on is the use of evidence-based practice within the system, collecting and analyzing data about the system, and continuous improvement. And what you'll see where the data, some of the publicly available data, is disseminated every year by the Juvenile Court Judges Commission. So that was a big part in the evolution of the system. This is a lot of reform that happened. And so, basically, despite that reform, system leaders, including the governor at the time, who was Governor Tom Wolf, and several legislative leaders, identified that basically, we've had all these reforms, but Pennsylvania was still incarcerating young people at a rate that was higher than the national average. Even though the levels of incarceration dropped, it looked a lot like the drop in crime. So it's what you would have expected to see based on the number of crimes that were being committed. And so Governor Wolf in 2019, and along with those leaders that called for this establishment as well, was a juvenile justice task force. It was a bipartisan, multi-branch task force that wanted to make data-driven recommendations. First, assess the system and look at data about the system, and then make recommendations for policy, funding, administrative changes for how to reform it and continue to improve. And so they impaneled this task force, and they heard from folks that worked in the system, folks that were impacted by the system, a broad range of stakeholders, and examined the data. And in 2021, released a comprehensive report and 35 recommendations for how the system could be improved. Thank you, Margot. And Margot dropped a link in the chat in case you have some time for not very light reading. But if you're very interested, some of the high-level findings were that most Pennsylvania youth are coming into the juvenile justice system for low-level behavior. Most of them are committing misdemeanors or held in contempt for not paying a fine from another issue. That youth diversion, which Nadia is going to get into a little bit more, a way to settle youth behavior outside of court, is underutilized. That kids who are committing low-level offenses are often ending up on probation or in residential placement. And basically that once young people did end up in placement and on probation, they were staying longer than would be expected. Children that were sent to facilities might average more than 3 years under overall court supervision, which is a really long period of time for anyone, but especially for a child. They also highlighted racial disparities, that they were significant, and particularly so for Black boys who receive the most punitive responses, including removal from their homes and being prosecuted as adults. So 35 recommendations came from those findings, and those weren't all legislative, but many of them were legislative recommendations. And those formed the basis for legislation that was advanced by the launched in 2023 Youth Safety Caucus, which was a group of legislative leaders, and the Youth Safety Coalition, which is a group of statewide advocates focused on advancing these reforms. So in 2023, those of us who are speaking on this call and a lot of other groups who are really invested in seeing these changes happen, we're advancing several bills based on those recommendations, but perhaps the most expansive was House Bill 1381, which was an omnibus piece of legislation that covers many of the recommendations. It did receive a passing vote in a House committee. Again, Nadia is going to talk a little bit about the legislative process and what that means, but the House never, or the bill never advanced beyond that space. It never received a full vote in the House, and so was not enacted into law. Folks realized that might be really hard for people to get on board with such a large, comprehensive bill. And so last year, 2024, the legislature and a group of committed legislators, along with some advocates, announced their support of what is now known as the CARE package, which is, I think we're at 13 now. It might be off by the exact number, separate bills representing the components of these recommendations that have been around for so long, plus some things that reflect issues that maybe weren't happening at that time, but are more prominent now. And again, we'll get into that in a minute. And that brings us to this year, 2025, and the exciting rebranding and launch of the PA Youth Justice Alliance, of which we're really proud to be a part of, and along with many of the folks on this call. So that's kind of the timeline that we're looking at and how we got to today. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context politically and just that we're working within, and kind of lay a little bit of groundwork for the policy proposals that Nadia is going to talk about soon. First is the federal context. Really, I feel like this is just on a lot of folks' mind. The reality is that federal law, it sets the minimum standards for state and local system, but much of the structure and processes are dictated by state statute. So while the federal government does set some overarching expectations, most of the things that really impact the day-to-day happen at the state level, or in states like Pennsylvania, even at the county level. Some of the biggest pieces of federal policy, the most notable perhaps is the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which is otherwise known as the JJDPA, which was passed in 1974. It basically set minimum standards for those state and local systems. It provides for a nationwide advisory system that goes across states and territories. It establishes federal funding for prevention and improvements in those state and local practices, and sets the operation of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which is the entity that provides many grants to state and local governments and other entities to do innovations, to support programming, technical assistance, and training for just system improvement efforts. In the current administration, you've probably heard about this being said with many other areas as well, but a lot of those grants have faced constriction or cuts are no longer being announced. There is a new bipartisan bill to reauthorize the JJDPA that was just introduced, I think, how long ago was June? 5 months ago now. And so we're, hopeful that some of those investments will be renewed, but the loss of federal funding can have an impact significantly on what states and local governments are able to offer in terms of those preventive services, those innovative services that keep kids in their communities. So that's really the thing to keep in mind about the federal government's impact. Let me go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about the state context. So lastly, like I said, the most direct impact is here at the state level. One thing that's really important to note is the PA General Assembly. That's our legislative body. They work year round. This looks different in different states. Some have a designated kind of season that their legislature works in. Ours is there pretty much all year with some time out of session here and there. They operate on a 2-year session. And the most recent session started this January, in January 2025. So any of the bills, like the House Bill 1381 that I mentioned, anything introduced prior to January 1st was considered dead and had to be either reintroduced or rethought for this year. So we had to start fresh in January. Another important thing to know about is the makeup of our legislature. And this has perhaps the most significant impact on, how legislation moves. And we have basically a split party system in our legislature, in that Republicans have the majority in the Senate by 4 seats, and Democrats hold the House majority by 1 seat. Both of those majorities are very slim. But what this means when you don't have, the same party running both chambers, it means there's not a lot of room for just kind of, what some other states might do, where they just push things through and they pass a ton of legislation because everyone agrees about everything. Here, you have to recognize that if one party is championing something, the other party is going to be the one in charge when they receive it in the following chamber. So the best chance at getting something done is to look for policy proposals that have the broad bipartisan support and that speak to members of the legislature and their constituencies that represent a wide range of people. So not just urban populations, including urban, suburban, rural, diverse racially, ethnically, economically, which can be really hard to do, right? There's many proposals out there. Like I said, there's 13-ish bills that are part of the care package. They have varying levels of impact and are at different stages of the system. This kind of dynamic led the PA Youth Justice Alliance to really focus our bandwidth at this time, energy, I should say, at this time, on the items that seem to have the most broad support. And so Nadia is going to walk you through what the legislative process itself looks like, including where those policy proposals that are really moving right now are at in that process, and all of their status. So, and folks, if folks have questions about any of that, please throw them into the Q&A and we'll be happy to answer them. But I'm going to pass it to Nadia.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And thanks again for folks joining us today. We in the next few slides, we're going to really dig into the 13 pieces of legislation that our alliance is working on, and we'll kind of highlight the various stages that they're at. Because there's so many bills, we're only going to be able to provide a high level overview of what's in them. But if you have questions, you want to see bill language, anything, please just drop us a question or reach out to us, and we're happy to chat more about the specific bills. But before we go into that, I wanted to start with a quick overview of what the legislative process looks like in Pennsylvania. So as we talk about where bills are along this spectrum, you will understand, kind of how much progress they've made. So at the beginning, when a legislator wants to write a piece of legislation, pass a law on a certain topic, the first thing they do is write what is known as a co-sponsorship memo. And that memo is just a very brief, it could be a few paragraphs, which just says the problem that they're trying to solve and how they're going to solve it and what their legislation says. So I think this is not good. I'm going to introduce a piece of legislation that does X, Y, and Z to solve this problem, and I want you to join me. And so what the co-sponsorship memo does is it really invites other legislators to join their efforts and be part of this team that's going to introduce legislation. So once a memo co-sponsorship memo is out, they'll give it a little bit of time to see who else is interested in joining, and they'll introduce a piece of legislation which will have the actual text of what is going to become law. And almost as soon as a piece of legislation is introduced, it is sent to a committee. And within the committees are based on different subjects, so they'll have expertise in different areas, and they'll talk about the bill, they'll kind of discuss it amongst themselves. Committees are made up of both parties. Again, there's representation from both parties. And once the committee has a chance to talk about a bill, they will vote on it, and then it will go onto the floor of the chamber. Just a note that in this diagram, we have House floor vote first and then Senate, but it really can either start in the Senate or it can start in the House or both. So just know that that could be changed. But for the purpose of most of the bills we're going to be talking about today, they're going to be in committees in the House of Representatives of PA. When they get voted out of committee, they're going to go to the floor, which is all the House of Representatives. All those people are going to vote on it. And if it passes, then it would move to the Senate. Again, it's kind of like the bill starts over a little bit. It would get put in a Senate committee. That committee would decide. It would get voted on by the Senate, and then the governor would sign the bill. So quite a few steps, a lot. Sometimes bills need to go to more than one committee. Sometimes they need to be amended at various points. So a lot can happen from co-sponsorship memo to governor signing bill. And as Stephanie said, in Pennsylvania, it's a 2-year process. You have 2 years to complete all of these steps. And if you don't complete it at that time, then you have to start over next time. So, but we're still not done with the first year of our legislative session this time. So we have a whole nother year to kind of accomplish everything that we're going to be talking about today. All right. So right now, I'm going to quickly go over all of the pieces of legislation that we are working on within various degrees. So these are the pieces of legislation that are in the what has been named the CARE package. And they are from recommendations that have come out of the task force report, and also recommendations that all of us have been working on, urging, wanting to see for many, many years. So things that we think are really important. So there's a number of pieces of legislation where, as I was describing before, a co-sponsorship memo has been released, but there isn't legislation on them yet. So we anticipate that there could be, but right now all that's happened for the bills is that there is a co-sponsorship memo out. And so for these bills, I'll quickly go over them, and then, like I said, I'm happy to answer questions or we're happy to discuss more. So first, limiting juvenile detention to most serious cases. Representative Krajewski from Philadelphia wrote the co-sponsorship memo, and the bill will exclude young people from being held in detention facilities under certain conditions. So if they're under 14, if they're pregnant or parenting, if they're charged with a misdemeanor or nonviolent felony, or for just a technical violation, but overall to really reduce juvenile detention because high detention just continues to be a problem in Pennsylvania. Second, limiting juvenile probation and use of delinquency versus dependency, really looking at not removing youth from their homes unless they pose a significant risk or they require special treatment, and eliminating youth incarceration just because of technical violations, which we know is a huge driver of young people into the system. And it limits juvenile probation to 1 year for misdemeanors or 18 months for felonies, ensuring that kids are just not stuck in probation forever. Next, Representatives Miller and Fleming wrote a co-sponsorship memo for a bill that would make Miranda rights simpler and easier for kids to understand. And then finally, Representatives Miller and Kincaid wrote a co-sponsorship memo for a bill that would strengthen educational stability by, for example, creating a education stability team, requiring that education progress is measured, requiring that facilities and agencies support young people in compliance with IEPs and 504 plans. So again, we don't have a lot of information at this point about when bills are going to be introduced in this area, but there are co-sponsorship memos written. And so if there are folks on this call or there's someone with a special interest in these topics, the ask at this point would be, okay, you already have the co-sponsorship memo, asking folks to sign on and join the co-sponsorship, and then asking for legislation to be introduced in this area. Thank you. Next slide. Perfect. Then we have a series of pieces of legislation that have been introduced and currently are in committee. So these are the bills that are on the screen now. So it's limiting the use of how solitary confinement is used. There is a bill that ends all charging of kids as adults. So no direct file, no transfer, just kids have to stay in the juvenile system. Raising the minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction from 10 to 13. So it would be if you're younger than 13, you can't get in trouble in the juvenile system anymore. And then finally, the two bills that are highlighted at the end, we're very excited about, because not only are they in the committee, but next Tuesday, there's going to be a committee vote on them. And that one is expanding diversion for youth in the juvenile justice system and total detention time, a time served bill. So the diversion, for folks that may not be familiar, diversion programs are programs that take as described, divert kids away from like a formal processing through the juvenile justice system, and instead gives them an alternative program or services that if they complete them, then they won't face consequences or the records of the juvenile justice system. And so what this bill does is it requires judges to use diversion programs more than they do now. So if it's a first or second misdemeanor or a first felony, a judge would have to give the child an opportunity to go to a diversion program instead of a more formal and often more harmful court process. And then finally, Representative Bellman has introduced a bill that we've kind of been calling the total detention time and time served bill. This bill is aiming to solve the problem that there are many young people that are just staying in detention forever because space is not opening up in placements. And so none of the time that they're staying in detention is counting towards like their total treatment time or how long they're actually incarcerated. So this bill requires more review hearings of kids in detention and assuring that that time is taken into consideration. And what the hope is that it will ensure that kids spend less time just kind of languishing in facilities without any services and without being free. Great. And then, so those two last bills, we are anticipating a hearing on them in the Children and Youth Committee next week, and which is a great sign. And then we're happy to report that there's another bill, HB 1385, eliminating fines and limiting court fees. That is a bill that was in the Judiciary Committee. It just got voted out of the Judiciary Committee yesterday. So much is happening yesterday. And so now it's waiting on the House floor for a vote. So what this bill does is it eliminates when kids are in the system, any courts or agencies or counties are not allowed to charge them most administrative fees And it eliminates fines. It also makes some changes to restitution and summary offenses as well. So that is on the House floor. And then finally, we have 3 bills that are all been introduced by Representative Schusterman, and those had their co-sponsorship memo. They went through their committee meetings, they went through the House floor vote, and they passed out of the House. And now that they're in the Senate, and they're waiting for the Senate committee to act on them. And these 3 bills all kind of have to do, so the first one requires data collection. It requires DHS to collect kind of an inventory of programs and services that are available to juvenile, to address kind of juvenile delinquency across Pennsylvania. The second one requires DHS to reimburse counties, DHS, Department of Human Services, to reimburse counties for certain costs related to young people in the juvenile justice system. And then finally, the last bill limits restrictive procedures, which are things like chemical restraints or mechanical restraints, which can be things like shackles or other restraints, which I think many of us that work in the field know is just, ways that staff can be physical with kids. So it limits all of those things to really when it's very necessary. So a lot of bills, a lot of information kind of all over the place, but it does, I think our goal in sharing these with you today is, if there's a certain topic that you know a lot about, you really care about, you have a personal story about, that this little bit of information you will, kind of help you figure out which pieces are most important to you and how you should do advocacy on that. And so essentially our goal with all of these pieces is to speak to legislators and tell them why these pieces of legislation are so important. And of course, we want the bills to pass, but essentially the specific ask we always want to make a legislator is taking the bill to the next step. So if it's a co-sponsor, having a bill introduced. If it's in the committee, having it go out of the committee. If it's, in the floor, passing a floor vote. So that's why we wanted to show you kind of where along the spectrum each bill is, so you can tailor your ask to really the next step, because that's what is going to be top of mind for legislators. And so the legislators that we're generally speaking to are those, especially in the Judiciary Committee and Children and Youth Committee, which is where most of our bills are. So particularly if you live in an area where your legislator is on one of those committees, it's really helpful to reach out to them and share your interest and your experience in these areas. And now that we have at least one bill moving to the House floor, hopefully a few others after next week, we are also speaking to House of Representatives leadership so they can bring some of these out to a vote. When you are speaking to legislators, really what's effective is personal experience stories, whether that's your personal experience working in an area, your personal experience within, be experiencing some of these systems. And that really is the key to changing hearts and minds. As we know, and Stephanie explained to us, we really need to get a wide, bipartisan, diverse support for our bills. And it has been, I think, both shown by research as well as certainly our personal experience, that it's these real constituent stories, personal stories, that really is able to change people's perspectives. And then from either a personal or an organizational perspective, we are looking, letters of support is always helpful. It's always important. So you can send, in addition to, visits and phone calls and all of that, letters of support are a way to reach out to legislators and express your support for a piece of bill. So a lot to do, but we still have a lot of time to do it. And yeah, so I'll pass it to Margot for messaging.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I feel a little bit like I just went to school. So If anybody else is also feeling that way, please feel free to put any questions or reactions that you have into either the Q&A function or the chat. A couple folks have been asking in the chat about the document that we've been sharing. So for sure, we will share this PowerPoint. We're also recording the webinar. So if you registered for the webinar, you'll get the recording of it and also the PowerPoint. And also Andy asked in the chat a helpful question, which is the spreadsheet that I shared there that has each bill and how it's moving and whatever the latest is. We are updating that on a regular basis. So as stuff moves, or if you just, are not tracking very closely what's happening in Harrisburg every single week, feel free to just tap into that whenever it feels useful to you, and it should be up to date. So I'm going to go ahead and switch gears a little bit here because we wanted to open up some kind of behind the scenes polling work that we've been doing and share it with our community. And we wanted to share this for a couple of reasons. One is that we think it's interesting. I have spent now quite a bit of time kind of wrestling with these data and thinking about the responses that we found. And I still find it fascinating, some of what we saw. Also because these poll results have deeply informed the work that we're doing during this legislative session. And so the strategy that you just heard Stephanie and Nadia describe, it's a reaction to our current moment for sure. I think we all realize that we're living in sort of a different political moment than we were a year ago. But these poll results have really in many ways given us the tools to engage with that moment effectively. So I'm going to describe first the process and then share a little bit about the results of what we saw. So about a year ago, it was in the lead up to the 2024 presidential election, we contracted with a polling firm that did what's called message testing, which is essentially a type of polling where a sample of Pennsylvania voters were shown different messages on certain topics and then ask questions about basically what changed for them after having viewed or listened to the messages. We tested 3 different topics: a general youth incarceration message, a direct file and adult prosecution message, and a diversion message. So the youth incarceration testing was really just to get a general sense of how folks think about the fact that kids can be locked up. The direct file in Pennsylvania, I know there's some folks who are not from PA, so just to be not jargony, direct file is our auto charge statute in Pennsylvania. It's the process by which children are automatically charged as if they're adults for a list of 10 serious offenses, if they are 15, 16, or 17, or if they're anywhere 10 or older for homicide. So yeah, the direct file messaging, this is something that's very important to YSRP because we work with young people who are being charged as if they were adults. So we were interested in finding out how people react to different types of messaging about kids who by their nature have committed more serious offenses. And then finally, we suspected, and it turns out we were right, that's just a little preview, that diversion was an issue that had somewhat broader bipartisan appeal. And so we were interested in testing which types of messaging on diversion were going to be most effective. So now I'm going to show you the results by each issue. So on the youth incarceration topic, we showed samples of voters. I won't go into like the details of the sample distribution, but we showed samples of voters 2 different types of messages. The first was a cost and research message, which you can read a sort of summary of what it looked like. And the second was a message that was really based around like, hey, there are alternatives to youth incarceration and they work pretty well. What we saw with that was that the cost and research message had about a 4.6% increase in moving people's opinion towards supporting limits on youth incarceration. Not the elimination of youth incarceration, but just limits on it. But the alternatives message was much more effective. So you see a bigger impact in terms of they're both positive, which is good, right? People, when they hear these messages, they respond by saying like, oh yeah, maybe we should limit youth incarceration. But they respond more strongly that way with the alternatives messaging. And something that was particularly interesting on this topic is that both messages were positive with both Republicans and Democrats, with both folks in rural areas and suburban and urban areas. But the alternatives work message was more popular with folks in rural areas. So Stephanie talked about the need to create bipartisan consensus in order to move anything in the Pennsylvania legislature. This is a thing that can be hard to wrap our minds around for those of us who live and work and breathe in Philly. It can be hard to realize that we have to engage folks from other parts of the state in order to be effective in Harrisburg. And so we saw this, that the type of messaging that really is positive and focuses on safety and investment in children was what was more effective for folks in rural areas. And also, interestingly, and I'm sure it's correlated, it was more effective with older people as well. So now taking a look at the direct file messaging, we chose two kind of different messages on direct file to try to test. I will say that I talk about direct file for my job all the time, and I've used both of these all the time. So neither one of them is like an outlier in how we might talk about this, but we wanted to pick ones that were pretty different so we could really see if there was a difference in what worked. The first one was about we see worse outcomes for direct file than for housing kids in the juvenile system. Pretty simple message. The second one was a little bit more nuanced and was really focused on the experience of the child, that kids miss out on a lot if they're incarcerated in an adult facility, that they miss their birthdays, they miss going to school, they miss being with their families. For those of us who work on issues related to direct file, we feel this deeply, and it can feel very harsh, the system for when kids are treated as adults, and deeply unfair. What we saw in the message testing, maybe this will be surprising to folks, maybe not, was that the worst outcomes frame was really effective. People like to think about the criminal legal system in terms of what works. And this frame around the child's experience really did not move people. And that 1.5% positive movement is masking some very large differences, because what you see when you look at the demographic breakdown is that for most Republicans, for older people, and for men, this framing around what kids miss out on actually had a negative impact on their support for reforming direct file. So this was a big learning for us, that we feel these issues very deeply, and we're not going to stop talking about the experience of children being in adult jail and prison. But I think when we're speaking to, depending on who the audience is, we might shift our focus. And then the third topic was on diversion. We tested two different messages on diversion. One was about its effectiveness. So really just this is a evidence-based, there's, at this point, 30 years of research backing up diversion being more effective than incarceration. And the second message was more Pennsylvania specific. It was about how diversion is applied unequally. So one of the things that our legislation on diversion is seeking to address is that there's no statewide standard on diversion. And what that means is that a kid can do the exact same thing in one county, and then right across the border of a county, they can be handled completely differently. So the first message was really about the effectiveness of diversion, and the second one was really about the inequality of it, both by geography and then also by race and class. And what we saw was that the effectiveness message was effective, it worked, and so did the inequality message. I think that positive 6.2, that's a pretty significant impact of just hearing a short little clip about something. And again, this was masking some bigger differences between them. Both frames were positive and they had an impact. The frame that talked about inequality was more motivating for people. So there were a couple follow-up questions that we asked. One was about support for policy change, and the other was about does this information motivate you to do something in your community? It could be donate, contact your legislator, or volunteer. And this second frame on diversion about it being unequally applied motivated people to want to take action in a way that none of the other ones across the different topics did. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there. I imagine that folks maybe have some questions about this. We have the poll memos. If anybody's interested, a data nerd and wants to dig in, you can reach out to me and we can take a look at those. But yeah, in summary, I think one other main takeaway from this whole process for me was that almost everybody on every topic said that they wanted more information about the topic in order to be able to make an informed decision. And so that says to me that we have some work as a coalition and as a sector to do to really get folks up to speed on what are these issues, what are the problems, what are kids experiencing in this system. And yeah, just to say again that we have taken these learnings and used them to both craft the messaging that we're using in public on social media, and then also in what we're focusing our first round of energy on in this legislative cycle. So with that, I will turn it to questions. And I think that if folks want to either put questions in the chat or in the Q&A, that's probably the easiest way to do this. But yeah, we're here for any questions or comments or musings. Beth asked a question about how we put the framing research into a toolkit to help folks apply it. We have a toolkit that we've been using internally. We haven't shared it publicly. I think as this alliance grows, I would love to do more of that type of work. I also think that as we do more work around base building and grassroots training for folks to speak to their legislators and share their own stories, that this will be a big part of it, is like trying to train folks, not just in like the mechanics of how to speak to your legislator, but also knowing who the audience is and what might be effective with that audience. Okay, there's a question from Alexis in the chat about pending legislation that has to do with resentencing for convicted folks who committed crimes as young people. Not an ignorant question at all. There are several pieces of legislation that deal with this, and also there's a pending Supreme Court case that folks may have heard about called Lee that we're expecting a decision on any second now that deals with the constitutionality of the sentence for felony murder, which folks may or may not realize is disproportionately folks who are young are sentenced for that. So yeah, Alexis, if you want to send me an email, I'll switch over to the contact slide so everybody has our email address. I'm happy to connect with you about pending legislation on resentencing. Anything else? Stephanie or Nadia, you want to add anything to either of those?
Not to that question, but just wanted to I had to put it in the chat, but just let folks know that if anyone wants to have follow-up conversations about the work that we're doing, please reach out, whether you are ready to roll and join the PA Youth Justice Alliance or are just want to talk more about it and learn more, since this was a lot to learn in 1 hour. If you're not already part, which I know some of you are, we would love to chat.
And we also have template support letters available. So if folks are interested in sending a support letter, we can send you the template, and then you just add a little bit about your personal story or your organizational background. We also are always would love to meet young people or folks who went through the juvenile justice system and experienced some of the issues that this legislation is addressing, because we think those stories are very compelling. And even if someone doesn't directly want to share them through the Alliance, there's opportunities for us to uplift those stories as well, or work on op-eds. So there's just so many avenues for working on these issues. So if there's particularly for folks who have experience in them, please reach out to us for that as well.
And if folks are excited about joining the Youth Justice Alliance, we have monthly meetings, and those are open to anybody who is an ally. So you can reach out on Instagram, you can email any one of us, and we'll get you added to those calendar invites. Cool. With that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Folks will receive a copy of the recording as well as the presentation, but please also feel welcome to reach out. We'd love to talk more. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.